in February of 90, Baker goes to Moscow, and his prime purpose was to try to convince Gorbachev and the Soviets that we needed an external process to match what looked like was happening on the ground, the internal unification. And that's what led to the so-called 2+4. And the logic there was you had the two Germanys in the front, and we wanted to emphasize that because we didn't want to block unification. But the four were the four powers coming out of World War II and the Potsdam Accords, so the United States, Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France. And the reason you needed some group like that was you still had the four-power rights from World War II, including over Berlin. You had 380,000 troops in the East. And so we needed an external mechanism that sort of matched what we hope would be the internal mechanism. While there, Baker was also making the argument that the Soviets should agree to a united Germany in NATO. Now, again, we've sort of assumed over 30 years this is an acceptable idea. At the time, this was seen as very controversial if you look at the editorial opinion. And Baker posed a hypothetical to Gorbachev. He said, you know, would you prefer to have a united Germany, sort of independent, neutral, not linked to the West, in the heart of Europe, or would you prefer to have a united Germany in NATO with the jurisdiction not 1 inch further? Now, what he was trying to do was he was trying to force Gorbachev to face a difficult choice. Of course, Gorbachev didn't want a united Germany in NATO given the Cold War history. But how did he like the idea of sort of recreating a powerful Germany in the center of Europe that might have to worry about its security and its borders and others? And so in a sense, Baker was hearkening back to the experience of the 20th century. Now, it's that hypothetical that Putin goes back on, but then one has to look at what happens during the rest of 1990.
For the reunification of Germany. Gorbachev and Jim Baker. Jim Baker says to Gorbachev, you know, in the treaty it says, you know, no NATO troops in what was then East Germany. In the discussions, and I had this conversation with Gorbachev last summer, he told me very directly, the conversation with Jim Baker, the question was, Baker saying, NATO, if you agree to reunification of Germany in NATO, NATO will not expand 1 inch further east, which is what I went to see Gorbachev to confirm, because I care so much about this. Is this true? Now, the interpretation on the American side, Scowcroft says, well, he misinterpreted. Baker, I haven't quite pinned down. But Gorbachev says very specifically, he said, if you expand 1 inch further, if you allow reunification, Germany and NATO, NATO will not expand 1 inch further east. And then Gorbachev told me, Kohl told him the same thing, which was new information, right? So the first Bush keeps his promise. Assume it's a promise. They talk about partnership for peace, and you know, Russians kind of like that idea. And then Clinton comes in. What's the early thing he does in his first term? He expands NATO. Why expand NATO? And I read, and I've been rereading because I've been thinking of writing something about this, Strobe Talbot's article in Foreign Affairs about why expand NATO, and you read it and you say, huh, that's a reason? You know? And last summer again, I'm talking to a number of people that I've known for many years, two guys who ran for president in Russia in 1996 and 2000. And you know, one of them says to me, I'm out campaigning in the Urals. Somebody comes up to me and says, this is 96. Why are the Americans expanding NATO? Isn't that a military alliance? And they said, well, yeah, but it's a military alliance. And the guy said, the politician said, Russians might not be able to understand puts and calls, but they certainly understand tanks, right? And think of it this way. What would any Politics 101, somebody who's a friend, supporter goes bankrupt. What do? You call them up on the phone and say, you know, Joe, it's tough. I know things are going to be okay. You're going to be back. You know, you show them some respect. And what did we do? We kicked them when they were down. We expanded NATO. And in expanding NATO, created the issue that allows the authoritarianism that has returned to say it was justified. And I think that it was a blunder of monumental proportions.
Our nation has labored and sacrificed for this goal for more than 5 decades now. And now it is within reach. So in Europe next week, we'll have the chance to strengthen the values we all hold dear: freedom, democracy, security. Our work in Madrid will be a capstone of our nation's leadership throughout the 20th century and a cornerstone for a new age of possibility in the 21st century. Enlarging NATO will erase the artificial line in Europe drawn by Stalin at the end of World War II. And NATO will now help Europe to come together in security, not be kept apart in instability.
I believe it's a mistake. It's a bad mistake.
И меня не убедят заявления, декларации самого такого респектабельного характера относительно того, что России нечего беспокоить.
And I'm not persuaded by the assurances that we hear that Russia has nothing to worry about. That was abruptly suspended or terminated in 1990.
Нельзя унижать народ, нацию, и нельзя рассчитывать, что это так пройдет все.
You may not humiliate a nation, a people, and think that it'll have no consequences.
Ну и другое, это что уже, новая стратегия?
So my question is this a new strategy?
Вот если это будет продолжаться так, тогда все, о чем мы говорили, перечисляли, целый перечень проблем, их трудно будет решить.
I feel that if
начнем разыгрывать карты друг против друга.
I feel that if the same kind of games continue to be played, if one country plays some card against the other country, then all of those problems, all of those issues that we've been mentioning today will be very difficult to resolve.
With an open and peaceful transition that enjoys broad public support. Yes, we have more work to do. But for today, we remind the people of... Today we welcome Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic, finally erasing the boundary line the Cold War artificially imposed on the continent of Europe. Strengthening an alliance that now, clearly, is better preserved to keep the peace and preserve our security into the 21st century.
Today we proudly welcome Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. we welcome them into the ranks of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Here in Bucharest, we must make clear that NATO welcomes the aspirations of Georgia and Ukraine for their membership in NATO and offers them a clear path forward to meet that goal. So my country's position is clear. NATO should welcome Georgia and Ukraine into the Membership Action Plan.
It doesn't contribute to trust and predictability in our relations on an entirely new level. The appearance of a powerful military bloc along our borders would be taken in Russia as a direct threat to the security of my country.
But views, he insisted, had been exchanged coolly, without any ping-pong match of mutual blame.
Despite the fact that we have some outstanding problems and issues, the spirit of cooperation and search for compromise prevailed.
So what about those earlier threats to target missiles on countries housing US missile shield installations? What about his talk of a new arms race? Was there a danger of a new Cold War?
No, it's not possible. It's in nobody's interests. Maybe there are some interests which would want to gain some opportunities in the murky waters of another Cold War, but global players, I mean, neither Europe nor the United States nor Russia has any interest in returning to the past.
As far as NATO enlargement is concerned, we talked about it at length earlier today. I reaffirmed Russia's position on this count. I believe that in order to improve relations with Russia, it is necessary not to pull the former Soviet republics into political military blocs, but to develop relations with Russia itself. And then the actions of the bloc on this or that issue in a few years will not be perceived so acutely in this country as is the case today. As far as enlargement is concerned, technical enlargement of NATO, I believe that this is a policy which is in conformity with a former old logic when Russia was perceived as an adversary, which is no longer the case today. As Churchill said, if you can't change the subject, it is a sign of radicalism.
Secretary General Yaptahub Skeffer says the two countries will eventually be a part of NATO.
But I stand to be corrected if the sentence we agreed today that these countries in the text, read Ukraine and Georgia, will become members of NATO, leaves a shimmer of a doubt. Not in my opinion.
A war that destroyed families and divided communities was driven, she says, not by people but by politics. The impulsive Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili, who thought NATO would support him in a war with Russia. Russia, meanwhile, calculating correctly that it would not. In the end, there was little NATO appetite for war with Russia over Georgia. The breakaway regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia were lost, along with villages like tiny Abrevi over here behind a barbed wire fence.
It looks like Odessa really is a very important piece of real estate, as it was honored with a very special new governor appointed on May 30th of 2015. Mikhail Saakashvili, an old friend of the United States and born and raised in Ukraine's neighboring country, Georgia.
A little hoedown there in Georgia.
A quick look at his biography gives one an understanding that he's been groomed for a special mission. Mr. Saakashvili received a U.S. State Department scholarship, and he worked for a New York law firm which represented the organization Kamara, a group that appeared earlier when we learned about the color revolutions.
We are dealing with democratic, bloodless revolution.
This is the Revolution of Roses, and this is Mikhail Saakashvili with Kamara, busy overthrowing the legitimately elected president, Eduard Shevardnadze.
Remove the government by peaceful means. That's classics, you know, you're really European.
Soon after the Rose Revolution blossomed fully, Georgia announced its intentions to join NATO and plant fresh NATO military bases in the fertile soil right on Russia's border.
Never ever we will give our freedom and independence. Never ever will give any piece of our territory.
Saakashvili's mission was accomplished, at least with his friends in NATO. The Georgian populace wasn't quite as happy, though. In 2007, they took to the streets to voice discontent, and Mr. Saakashvili responded with force. The people's discontent grew. Saakashvili's party lost parliamentary elections, and the opposition took control.
He said this means that the parliamentary majority should set up a new government and me as the president, according to our constitution.
Mikhail decided not to wait for the results of the president's election and fled the country in October 2013. In 2014, Saakashvili refused summons to appear in court as a witness in several criminal cases. Later that same year, he was accused of misuse of power and embezzlement. Saakashvili wound up in the U.S., and soon his friends in Washington found him a new assignment. Mikhail actively supported Maidan, and very soon was rewarded with a high position in the new Ukrainian government. First as the president's counselor, and then as the governor of Odessa. The day before taking this position, he renounced his citizenship to Georgia, the country of his birth, and became a Ukrainian citizen.
Я навсегда останусь гордым гражданином моей гордой Родины. Гордым гражданином моей гордой Родины.
As they say, the battle is worth the blood, both literally and figuratively.
Я прекрасно знаю реальную цену реформ господина Саакашвили. Я прекрасно знаю то, что он на Украине на самом деле является частью проекта, который нужно осуществить Украине определенным силам.
Jeffrey Payet, the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, paid a visit to Saakashvili just a month after he took office in Odessa.
But as long as the Oblast administration is delivering results on Ukraine, you are going to see a steady flow of embassy and Washington visitors coming here.
The meeting was fruitful, and Jeffrey generous. No matter how well Saakashvili's job goes, it looks like he shouldn't be worried about his own finances. On his Facebook page, he posted an official document showing that the new governor of Odessa gets a pretty penny from Washington, almost $200,000 a year. For comparison, the governor of Maine gets $70,000 a year. So if Odessa became a new U.S. state, it would be at the top of the list. Mr. Saakashvili should feel right at home in his newly adopted country. He is best of friends with fellow color revolutionary leader Viktor Yushchenko, who's the godfather of his son.